So we're back. Let's talk about the intended audience. Actually, going back to one of the other videos for earlier this week, where we talked about these components of the article critique. One of the things I mentioned about it, the intended audience, is you can look at what journal published that particular piece. Word and World, even its very title tells us we're looking at how the Word, the Bible, right, the Word of God, as Christians call it, how the Word interacts with the world, with some bigger issues beyond just the scope of religion. Or, for me, I don't think anything's beyond the scope of religion. I think it's one of the foremost issues about which people think and governs their thinking at the same time. So, Word and World, obviously you've kind of a nice alliteration there as you think about the Word of God and the world in which we live. So that tells you something, but I think there's a little bit more that we can look at. So in biblical studies, we commonly talk about internal evidence and external evidence. Internal evidence is evidence from the piece that you're working on right then. So, like, I may read the letter to the Ephesians that Paul wrote, and St. Paul is the tradition says that St. Paul wrote it. There's scholarly debate about whether that is in fact the case or a Pauline disciple wrote it. In any event, so I've got the internal evidence from the book of Ephesians, but I also might go to the book of Acts in chapter 19, I believe it is, where Paul is introduced to. He goes to Ephesus. And so while it's still the Bible, we might think, one way we might think about it is that this information that we would have about Ephesus in the book of Acts might be external to the book of Ephesians, so that might be external evidence. That might give us some more data about which to ruminate as we think about what Paul is talking about in the book of Ephesians. We could also go to external evidence from history at around the same time in the first century in the city of Ephesus, and that would be helpful in understanding the milieu, the historical and cultural milieu in which St. Paul was working while in Ephesus and then writing to. Internal, external evidence. I think we've got some internal evidence. I think, okay, here's the emphasis, I think we have some internal evidence in the Tida article that helps us understand who his audience is. Now, if you notice, he starts with Patrick Dolan and with Max De Pree here on page 23 and the top of page 24. Then, in the first full paragraph on page 24, which is the second page of the article, he starts, "These people have been reading Luke's gospel without the permission of the exegetical guilds." That is, people like me who have devoted their lives to studying the scriptures, right? And so, but Dolan and De Pree are not biblical studies scholars. And Tida is kind of poking fun at ourselves, because he is in the guild, right? So he's poking fun at ourselves a little bit. And then he goes on to say, church leaders may be lured by the siren songs of strategic planning. Here we've got a reference, the siren songs, we reference to mythology, right? Conjuring powerful self-images as CEOs in the business world. So he is not just poking fun at biblical studies scholars, but he's also poking fun at pastors who see themselves as CEOs and are lured by strategic planning, and in doing that, becoming somewhat inflated in their view of themselves and in the church and in their role in the church, rather than taking the approach to leadership that he advocates Jesus is taking. So I think, now you may disagree with me, and that's totally fine with me, but I think this paragraph tells us something about who his audience is. I think Titus is writing to people like me who don't need to be so rooted in history and language and literature. We need to think about, of the New Testament or the Old Testament, we need to think more broadly about the text. Yeah, I think he's also, and I think primarily focused at pastors who forget what servant leadership, which is typically the kind of leadership model we think of when we think of Jesus. Pastors who have forgotten their need to be servant leaders rather than imagining themselves as titans of industry in their churches. So I think there's a little bit of a critique, a little bit of a jab, mostly at pastors, some to biblical studies scholars as well. You may think that that I'm wrong about that. I submit it for your thoughtful consideration. That's what I think he's doing here. So I think I've got a little internal evidence that we haven't always gotten in some of the other articles, but I think we've got something here that may be a little bit more precise. So if you think that I'm right, or if you think I'm wrong, and maybe that's a good way to approach it this time, right? You might say, I agree with Ragsdale because X, I disagree with Ragsdale because Y, and that's fine with me. I don't care. The point is not agreement or disagreement. The point is to have a vibrant conversation about these things. Okay, so we'll come back and we'll talk about a strength and we'll talk about a weakness. I'm not going to give you everything that I think because I don't want to skew your thinking too much. But I've got one strength and one weakness that I want to talk to you about related to this article as I see it. Again, you may disagree.